Hello and welcome to Puritan Preaching, where we seek to encourage you to preach one Christ, by Christ, to the praise of Christ. So the question today is, did the church get hell wrong? In a recent video clip, Kirk Cameron suggested that annihilationism is the way to go. And this is the idea that the wicked are ultimately destroyed rather than eternally punished. And he reckons that this fits better with the mercy and the character of God. But that is not the historic Christian position that is powerfully defended by Jonathan Edwards. He says something very different. He says that hell is eternal, conscious punishment, and it is just. So who's right? Does God's justice end in extinction or everlasting punishment? Today it is Kirk Cameron versus Jonathan Edwards. So what I want us to do right now is hear a clip from Kirk Cameron, and then we are going to look at the theology and teaching of Jonathan Edwards and see who we want to believe. We will look at two key sermons from Jonathan Edwards. But first, let us hear from Kirk Cameron now.
I've learned that there are other positions, and a very robust argument can be made for conditionalism or annihilationism, as Edward Fudge posits here. And it fits the character of God, in my understanding, more than the conscious eternal torment position, because it brings in the mercy of God together with the justice of God. It doesn't leave judgment out. It is just, but it also fits with the Old Testament picture of the fate of the wicked, which is to be destroyed, it is to die, and it is to perish.
Well, unfortunately, through this video, Kirk Cameron has opened up the door once more to annihilationism. And it's hard to take in that this door is being cracked open and people will believe this. Annihilationism essentially teaches that the wicked are not punished forever in conscious torment. But instead, what annihilationism argues is that they are destroyed. In other words, that they are brought to an end, that they cease to exist. Hell on this view is either brief or temporary, and it is followed by extinction and complete annihilation. Now, this is no new idea. This has been around for years, and it was one that Jonathan Edwards himself explicitly and repeatedly rejected. Now, let me just take a sidestep for a second. Maybe some of you, just for a second, might question whether Jonathan Edwards is indeed a Puritan. And if you question that, please look at my video that I provided. I believe it's Joel Beakey's Top 5 Puritans. Joel Beakey's Top 5 Puritans, and that will help you. But back to this idea. Edwards most specifically refuted annihilationism in two famous sermons. The Eternity of Hell Torments was the first, where he directly refutes annihilationism. It is his most systematic attack on this idea. And then his second sermon is the famous Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, where eternal conscious punishment and torment is assumed, it is illustrated, and it is preached with terrifying clarity, absolute terrifying clarity. And we're going to get to those two sermons now. The first is The Eternity of Hell's Torments by Edwards. This sermon is a phenomenally specific sermon where he explicitly answers all the questions and concerns that annihilationism would bring and all their arguments. He begins by naming the view outright. And this is the claim that eternal death actually means eternal annihilation, eternal abolition of one's being, abolition of their humanity. And he rejects it decisively. First, here's what he does. He says hell is sensible misery, not non-existence. Edwards' first argument is almost disalarmingly simple. When he says that hell is sensible misery, here is what he means. He means that those in hell have a knowledge, a specific knowledge or sense of everything that is taking place, everything that is happening. And no, I take no delight in saying this about hell. Scripture everywhere describes hell in this way. Scripture everywhere describes, as Edwards argues in the sermon, hell as pain, suffering, torment, and misery for eternity. But annihilation involves no sense at all, or sensation of any feeling at all. A person who does not exist feels no pain and bears no punishment. They experience no misery. Edwards states plainly that annihilated persons would, in his words, no more suffer to eternity than they did suffer from eternity. And this is the reality for Edwards in how he proclaims the realities of hell. And that alone, he says, makes annihilation incompatible, completely incompatible with all of the Bible's language. We cannot deny it. His second point is this: the wicked must know they are punished. Edwards presses this point even further when he says they must know that they are punished. Scripture repeatedly says that the wicked will know that God is just and their punishment is deserved and it is full. It is the full experience of the wrath of God, and that God has fulfilled what he has ultimately threatened to those who have rejected the offer of the gospel. But annihilationism removes all consciousness. A sinner who no longer exists cannot know God's justice, can they? They cannot recognize guilt. They cannot acknowledge the truth of God's true warnings, his warnings of punishment and his pleadings with people to turn. For Edwards, this destroys, absolutely destroys or annihilates the judicial purpose of punishment. And that is just wrong, clearly wrong. Thirdly, Edwards acknowledges that Scripture tells us that there's degrees of punishment for those who reject the gospel. Annihilationism, then, as Edwards introduces, is one of the strongest arguments against this reality, and that's just wrong. Scripture clearly teaches degrees of punishment. Many stripes and few stripes. That's the reality of Scripture. The greater and lesser condemnation. That's the reality of Scripture. The more tolerable and less tolerable judgments. That's the reality of Scripture. But annihilation has no degrees, he argues. You cannot be more annihilated. There's no degrees there. This is just the reality. You cannot be less annihilated, punished more or punished less when you are annihilated. Existence is either ended or it is not. And therefore, for Edwards, he concludes that hell must absolutely, even though it's harrowing to say, involve conscious, ongoing experience. And that is torment in hell. That is the reality of what we see. Fourth, the reality of the second death is not extinction at all. And Edwards addresses the phrase of what Scripture says is the second death. He argues it is called death by analogy. Not because it means non-existence. That is foolishness to say. Just as physical death, he argues, involves pain and distress and the realities of all that takes, the second death involves far greater torment, pain, stress. And crucially, the second death is shared with the devils. People don't share this alone. The devil's fear and torment, not annihilation, and not annihilationism. For Edwards, annihilation is not only unbiblical, it is too mild to express God's holy hatred of sin. And now we turn to sinners in the hands of an angry God. One of his most famous sermons, one of Edwards' most famous sermons that we have heard of and we know, well known throughout the generations, well known throughout church history, well known throughout the Puritans. And so we want to see what this has to say to us and the realities of hell being eternal. And I think this is one of the most famous sermons because of its theological clarity on the reality of hell. Edwards, he doesn't argue abstractly in the sermon. He argues with great depth of application to show what hell really means. And his most famous illustrations in the sermon that just pile image upon image upon image of the realities of hell. He pictures hell as the pit open beneath all sinners' feet, and all that is covering that pit, all that is covering it is a rotting covering. He talks about hell as the wrath of God's floodwaters that are dammed up and ready to be released, rising and rising until they are released upon sinners. He talks about the wrath of God being like a bow that is bent against the heart of every sinner. And most famously, he speaks about the sinner being held like a spider dangling on the slender thread of the web over the fires of hell. And every one of these images assumes something very crucial to our argument here. Hell is something you fall into. Hell is something you endure. Hell is something that you experience for eternity. It is not something that you disappear into. A spider dangling over fire does not represent extinction, but the realities of the eternality of hell's torment. It represents the experienced terror that sinners experience. And we see Edwards talk about God's active wrath, not his passive wrath. Throughout the sermon, it is his active wrath. Edwards insists that sinners, every sinner who rejects the gospel, is under the sentence of punishment. With their objects of God's wrath, not merely restrained from it from a moment, but experiencing it for eternity. Hell is not God stepping back. Hell is God acting, actively acting in his justice and holiness. Annihilationism would be a withdrawal of being. Edwards, however, he says, hell is an encounter of God's justice. He says specifically to fall into the hands of the living God is what it means to fall into hell. It is not to vanish. It is to be grasped by omnipotent wrath. He also talks about the eternal horizon of hell, the eternality of hell. It is not philosophical, it is for eternity. And he argues that this is presupposed everywhere in Scripture. He repeatedly speaks of the everlasting judgment of hell. He repeatedly speaks of the eternal wrath of hell. He repeatedly speaks that hell is non-ending misery of judgment. His appeal depends entirely upon the Scriptures themselves. If hell ended in annihilation, guess what? There would be no terror. There would be no urgency. And this rejects the gospel call that there is true refuge to be found. And if there's not true refuge, then that loses all its weight. A refuge only matters if danger is eternal. And so he argues in this sermon that the gospel appeal depends on the eternality of hell. Edwards offers Christ as the great shelter, Christ as the great refuge, Christ as the great hiding place. You do not flee to a refuge to avoid non-existence, do you? You flee to a refuge because that is exactly who Christ is, the refuge. You flee to a refuge to escape experience, and that experience is the fire of hell. If annihilationism were true, Edwards' sermon would be unintelligible, unimportant, not important. But it isn't that way, because Edwards understood what Scripture teaches in its full reality of hell, what Jesus himself taught in the full reality of hell, that hell is eternal, that hell is conscious, that hell magnifies both God's justice and his holiness and also his grace. This is the reality of hell. So please let us know what you think of this. And taken together, both of these sermons, it is the reality that both of these sermons leave no room for annihilationism. In the Eternity of Hell's Torments, like we saw the first sermon, Edwards explicitly refutes annihilationism. It is his most prolific argument against it. And in Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, the way he preaches in that sermon with the illustrations and everything else, it is impossible not to believe in the reality of hell. And so for Edwards, annihilationism fails biblically, it fails judicially, it fails morally, and it fails pastorally. It fails in every single way. Hell is not the removal of sinners and the extinction of sinners. Hell, it is the eternal manifestation of God's holy justice. And we must remember that from these sermons. So let me conclude with this. Please remember, preach one Christ, by Christ, to the praise of Christ. Because that, my friends, is Puritan preaching.